The city pulsed with its usual rhythm, a cacophony of honking horns, hurried footsteps, and snippets of conversation rising and falling like waves in the early evening air. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the crowded streets, but no one seemed to notice. Everyone was too busy, too caught up in their own rush to pay attention to the ambulance weaving through the congested traffic. Inside the vehicle, paramedic Laura adjusted her headset, her sharp eyes scanning the information on her tablet. Male, mid-50s, collapsed in Jefferson Park. Possible cardiac arrest. 2-minute E, she relayed to her partner, Ethan, who was gripping the wheel with practiced determination. Got it, Ethan replied, his focus unbroken as he navigated through the maze of cars. The siren blared, and the flashing lights painted streaks of red and blue on the buildings they sped past. Laura glanced out the window. People always freeze when they hear a siren, she muttered, mostly to herself. You'd think they'd know to move by now. Ethan smirked. It's part of the charm of city driving. They were less than a block from the park when it happened. Out of nowhere, a golden-furred dog dashed into the street, barking wildly. Its sudden appearance forced Ethan to slam the brakes, the ambulance screeching to a halt just inches from the animal. The jolt threw Laura forward against her seatbelt, and the supplies in the back rattled noisily. "What the hell?" Ethan exclaimed, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "A dog? Seriously?" Laura was already leaning forward, peering through the windshield at the unexpected obstacle. The dog was medium-sized, its fur matted and dirty, but its posture was unmistakable, tense, alert, and deliberate. It wasn't just wandering or lost. It had planted itself firmly in the path of the ambulance, barking with a sense of urgency that caught Laura's attention. "Wait," Laura said, holding up a hand as Ethan reached for the horn. "Look at it." Ethan frowned, but followed her gaze. The dog wasn't moving despite the loud siren and flashing lights. If anything, it seemed even more determined to block their path, its deep brown eyes locked on the vehicle. "Dogs don't usually do this," Laura murmured. "It's like it's trying to tell us something." "It's a stray, Laura," Ethan said impatiently, probably scared out of its mind. "We don't have time for this. We got a patient waiting." But Laura wasn't convinced. Something about the dog's behavior struck her as strange. It wasn't just frightened or confused. It was purposeful. It barked again, a sharp, insistent sound, then moved a few steps forward before stopping to look back at the ambulance, its tail wagging low and fast in a nervous rhythm. "It's leading us somewhere," Laura realized aloud. Ethan groaned. "You gotta be kidding me. I'm serious. Look at it. It's not just standing there. It wants us to follow. And what are we supposed to tell dispatch? Sorry, we're late because we followed dog?" Ethan shot back, his voice tinged with frustration. "Laura, every second counts." "I know that," she replied firmly. "But I think this is important. Just give me 2 minutes." Ethan sighed heavily, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. "Fine, but if this turns out to be nothing, I'm blaming you." Laura didn't wait for further argument. She unbuckled her seatbelt, grabbed her kit, and stepped out of the ambulance. The moment her boots hit the pavement, the dog stopped barking and wagged its tail, trotting toward her. It turned its head, looking back as if to make sure she was following. "What is it, boy?" Laura asked, crouching slightly and holding out a hand. The dog didn't approach, but instead took a few more steps forward, barking again and glancing back. Ethan leaned out the driver's side window. "This is ridiculous, Laura. You're trusting a dog to lead us somewhere." Ignoring him, Laura followed the dog as it darted toward a narrow alley on the left. The space was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, the kind of place most people wouldn't even notice in passing. The dog disappeared into the shadows, but its barking echoed faintly, guiding her deeper. "Laura!" Ethan called after her, exasperated, but she waved him off. The alley smelled damp and faintly of garbage, the faint light barely illuminating the path. Laura's heart pounded in her chest, not out of fear, but from a growing sense of urgency she couldn't explain. The dog's barking grew louder, and she quickened her pace, careful not to trip over the uneven ground. When she finally rounded a corner, she saw it. The dog was standing protectively over a pile of tattered blankets. For a moment, she thought it had just led her to its makeshift bed. But then she saw a hand sticking out from beneath the blankets, pale and motionless. "Oh my God," Laura whispered, dropping to her knees. The dog licked the hand, whining softly, then barked again at Laura, as if to say, "Help him." "Ethan," she shouted, her voice echoing off the narrow walls. "Get the stretcher, now!" Ethan's footsteps thundered behind her as he arrived, his expression shifting from frustration to alarm when he saw the scene. Laura was already assessing the man's condition, her training kicking in. He was unresponsive but breathing faintly, his skin clammy and pale. "Pulse is weak," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "He's hypothermic. We need to move fast." The dog barked again, pacing nervously as Ethan helped Laura lift the man onto the stretcher. It stayed close, never straying more than a few feet away, its eyes darting between the paramedics and the man it had been protecting. When they reached the ambulance, the dog tried to climb in after them, but Ethan blocked its way. "No pets," he said firmly. "Ethan, come on," Laura argued. "Look at him. This dog saved his life. We can't just leave him." Ethan hesitated, glancing at the dog. It sat by the open doors, its tail wagging slowly as if it understood Laura's plea. With a sigh, he stepped aside. "Fine, but if anyone asks, this was your idea." The dog leaped in and curled up at the man's feet, resting its head on his legs as the ambulance roared to life. Laura couldn't help but smile as she closed the doors. "You did good, buddy," she said softly. "You did real good." The journey to the hospital was tense, the ambulance swaying slightly as Ethan maneuvered through the streets. Laura sat beside the unconscious man, working quickly to stabilize him. Her hands moved with practiced precision, checking his pulse, monitoring his vitals, and administering oxygen. The man's face was pale, his lips tinged with a bluish hue. He didn't stir, and each shallow breath he took was a reminder of how fragile his condition was. Meanwhile, the dog stayed curled up at the man's feet, its body pressed protectively against the stretcher. It was quiet now, no longer barking, but its dark eyes were fixed on Laura, as if it understood that she was trying to help. Every so often, it would lift its head and whine softly before settling back down. "I've seen a lot of strange things on this job," Ethan said from the driver's seat, his voice breaking the silence. "But a dog leading us to a guy in an alley? That's a first." Laura glanced up from her work. "It's not strange, it's incredible. This dog might have saved his life. If it hadn't stopped us, no one would have found him in time." Ethan snorted. "I'm still wrapping my head around the fact that we're letting a stray ride in the ambulance." Laura shot him a look. "He's not just some stray, Ethan. Look at him. He's been with this man for who knows how long. You think he's leaving him now?" Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror at the dog, whose head was now resting on the man's legs. "Yeah, I guess not," he admitted grudgingly. "Still, we're going to get an earful for this." Laura ignored his grumbling, her focus back on the man. She checked the oxygen tank and adjusted the mask over his face. His breathing was stabilizing, but his pulse was still weak. She silently willed him to hold on a little longer. They were close to the hospital now, just a few more minutes. The dog shifted, sitting up and wagging its tail slightly, as if sensing the urgency in the air. It nudged the man's hand with its nose, then turned its gaze back to Laura. "You're worried about him, aren't you?" Laura said softly. She reached out and let her hand hover for a moment before gently scratching behind the dog's ears. Its fur was coarse and dirty, but the wag of its tail quickened at the touch. "You did good bringing us to him. We'll take care of him now." The dog licked her hand briefly before returning its attention to the man, leaning against him as if trying to lend him strength. Laura's chest tightened at the sight. She'd seen loyalty before in families and friends, but there was something uniquely pure about the bond between this dog and its human. It was unshakable, an unspoken promise of devotion. The ambulance pulled into the hospital bay, and the waiting medical team sprang into action. As the doors swung open, a nurse climbed in to help Laura and Ethan transfer the man onto a gurney. The dog jumped down after them, barking as the team wheeled the man toward the ER. "Someone get that dog out of here," one of the nurses said, frowning as it darted after the stretcher. "Wait," Laura called, holding up a hand. She crouched and placed a calming hand on the dog's back. "It's okay. He's in good hands now. We'll take care of him." The dog stopped barking but didn't budge from its spot, its eyes glued to the doors of the ER as they swung shut behind the gurney. It whined, its tail drooping, and Laura felt a pang of sympathy. "I'll stay with him," she told Ethan. "Go finish the paperwork." Ethan raised an eyebrow but shrugged. "Your call." Once they were alone in the waiting area, Laura sat on a bench, the dog sitting dutifully at her feet. It didn't try to wander or explore. It just sat there, its gaze unwavering. Laura studied it more closely. Despite its matted fur and thin frame, the dog looked healthy enough. Its eyes were bright, and its movements were purposeful. She wondered how long it had been with the man, long enough to form this kind of bond, clearly. Long enough to know that something was terribly wrong, and to do whatever it could to help. A nurse approached with a clipboard, her brow furrowed. "What's the story with the dog?" she asked. Laura glanced down. "It's his. He led us to the man in an alley. Without him, we wouldn't have found him in time." The nurse looked skeptical. "And you're sure it's his dog?" Laura nodded. "Absolutely. He hasn't left his side since we picked him up. They're bonded." The nurse sighed but softened. "Well, as long as he's not causing any trouble, I guess it's fine. Just try to keep him out of the way." "Will do," Laura said, relieved. The minutes ticked by, and the waiting room emptied and filled again with the ebb and flow of patients and visitors. The dog remained a constant, its quiet presence drawing occasional curious glances from passersby. Laura stayed by its side, giving it occasional pats and murmured reassurances. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor emerged from the ER. Laura stood immediately, the dog rising with her. "He's stable," the doctor said. "Severe hypothermia and signs of pneumonia, but we've got him on fluids and antibiotics. He's not out of the woods yet, but it's looking good." Laura let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That's great news." The dog barked once, its tail wagging furiously. The doctor gave it a bemused look. "I take it this is his dog." "Yeah," Laura said with a smile. "And he's not going anywhere." The doctor chuckled. "Well, as far as I'm concerned, he's earned the right to stick around. Just keep an eye on him." Laura nodded and knelt beside the dog, ruffling its fur. "Hear that? You're gonna be okay. You did your job, buddy." The dog licked her face, its joy evident. Laura felt a lump rise in her throat. In all her years as a paramedic, she'd witnessed plenty of heroics, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't just loyalty, it was love in its purest form. "You're a good boy," she whispered. "The best boy." The hospital room was dimly lit, with the steady hum of machines filling the quiet space. Peter, as the medical staff had identified him, lay motionless in the bed. His frail body was tucked under crisp white sheets, an oxygen mask secured over his face to aid his labored breathing. Tubes and wires snaked from his arms and chest, connecting him to monitors that beeped softly, their rhythmic sounds of faint reassurance that he was still alive. The golden-furred dog sat vigilantly by the bedside, its posture unwavering despite the exhaustion evident in its eyes. Every so often, it would rise, place its paws on the bed, and sniff Peter's hand gently, as if to remind itself that he was still there. When it wasn't doing that, it lay curled up on the floor, ears perked and alert to every sound, every movement. Laura watched from just inside the doorway, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed. She had stayed after her shift ended, unable to bring herself to leave. Something about this case was different. It wasn't just the man's critical condition or the dog's incredible actions. It was the bond between the two, unspoken yet palpable, that tugged at her heart in a way few things had in her years as a paramedic. A nurse walked by, pausing to glance at the scene. "He's lucky you found him," she said softly, nodding toward Peter. "Another hour, and he might not have made it." Laura shook her head. "It wasn't me. It was the dog. He led us right to him." The nurse's lips quirked into a small smile. It's amazing how animals can do that, isn't it? I've seen service dogs alert their owners to seizures and cats predict strokes. But this, she trailed off, gesturing toward the dog, which was now resting its head on the edge of the bed. This is something else? Laura nodded, her throat tightening. Yeah, it really is. The nurse moved on, leaving Laura to step into the room and sit in the chair by the bed. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, and studied Peter. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollowed, and his skin pale. He looked like someone who had been through unimaginable hardships, someone who had been fighting a silent battle for years. Her gaze shifted to the dog, whose eyes flicked up to meet hers. There was something intelligent and almost pleading in that look, as if it were asking her to do something, anything, to make sure its human was going to be okay. You've been taking care of him, haven't you? Laura said softly. The dog wagged its tail, slightly in response, a brief thump against the floor. Reaching down, Laura scratched behind its ears. I wonder how long you've been together. You didn't just stumble on him, did you? You've been with him through it all. She sat back, her thoughts drifting. Homelessness was a harsh reality she had encountered far too often in her line of work. People forgotten by society, left to fend for themselves in the shadows of the bustling city. But Peter wasn't alone. He had this dog, this fiercely loyal companion who had risked everything to save him. The door opened quietly, and a nurse entered, holding a small bundle of belongings in her arms. She placed them on the counter before turning to Laura. These were with him when he was brought in. Not much, just a few personal items. Laura stood and walked over to the counter. She opened the bundle, careful not to disturb the neatly folded clothes, and found a crumpled photograph tucked inside. She smoothed it out, her breath catching at the sight. It was a picture of Peter, much younger and healthier, smiling broadly. Beside him was the golden dog, its fur clean and shiny, and its tail a blur of motion caught mid-wag. They looked happy, carefree. On the back of the photo, a faded scrawl read, "Max, my best boy." Laura stared at the words, her chest tightening. She glanced at the dog, Max, now resting his head on Peter's hand. "So that's your name," she murmured. Max, the nurse leaned over, glancing at the photo. "Looks like they've been together a long time." "Yeah," Laura said, her voice thick. "They're more than just companions. They're family." Max stirred as Peter shifted slightly in his sleep, his breathing hitching for a moment before settling again. The dog stood, placing his paws on the bed and looking down at his owner with a soft whine. He licked Peter's hand, his tail wagging faintly as if willing him to wake up. Hours passed, and the quiet rhythm of the machines became almost soothing. Laura stayed, occasionally stepping out to get coffee or check her phone, but she always returned. She wasn't sure why she felt so compelled to stay. Maybe it was the dog, or maybe it was the image of Peter lying alone in that alley, abandoned by the world except for Max. Finally, as the first rays of dawn crept through the window, Peter stirred. His fingers twitched, and his eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy at first. Max barked softly, the sound full of relief and excitement. The dog's tail thumped against the side of the bed as it leaned closer, licking Peter's hand fervently. Peter blinked, his gaze shifting to the dog. His cracked lips curved into the faintest smile. "Max," he croaked, his voice barely audible. Laura felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she stepped forward. "You're in the hospital," she said gently. "We found you last night." "Well, Max found us?" Peter's gaze moved to her, then back to Max. He raised a trembling hand to rest it on the dog's head, his fingers curling weakly into the fur. "Good boy," he whispered. Laura's chest tightened. She crouched beside the bed, placing a comforting hand on Peter's arm. "You're going to be okay. We're taking care of you." Peter nodded faintly, his eyes closing again, but the small smile remained. Max lay down beside the bed, content now that his human was awake. Laura sat back, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. In that moment, she understood something she had always known, but had never seen so clearly. Love wasn't just a feeling. It was an action, a force, something that drove people and animals to do extraordinary things. Max's love for Peter had saved his life. and it was a love that would continue to sustain them both. Peter's recovery was slow, each day marked by small victories. At first, he could barely stay awake for more than a few minutes at a time, his body too weak to fight against the years of neglect it had endured. But Max never left his side. The dog became a constant fixture in the hospital room, resting at Peter's feet during the day and curling up beneath the bed at night. Whenever Peter opened his eyes, Max was there, his tail wagging softly, a reassuring presence in an unfamiliar place. Laura visited often, even on her days off. Something about the bond between Peter and Max had drawn her in, and she found herself invested in their story. She would bring small treats for Max, a squeaky toy, a bag of dog biscuits, and sit with Peter, coaxing him into conversation as his strength returned. One afternoon, as the golden light of sunset streamed through the window, Laura sat by Peter's bedside. He was propped up against a stack of pillows, his color much improved, and his voice no longer a faint whisper. Max lay at his feet, his head resting on Peter's ankle. "Max saved you, you know," Laura said, breaking the comfortable silence. "If it weren't for him, we never would have found you." Peter smiled faintly, his hand resting on Max's head. "He's always been like that. My guardian angel." Laura leaned forward, curious. "How long have you had him?" Peter's eyes softened as he looked at the dog. "Almost 10 years now. I found him as a puppy, abandoned on the side of the road. He was just skin and bones, barely alive. I didn't have much to give him back then, but I couldn't leave him there. I took him in, and somehow he gave me more than I ever gave him." Laura nodded, her throat tightening. "He loves you. That much is obvious." Peter's smile faded, replaced by a look of guilt. "I haven't always been the best for him. Life's been hard. After my wife passed, I lost everything. The house, the job, even friends. Max stuck with me, though, through it all. Even when I had nothing." Laura reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "You've given him what matters most. Love. And he's given it right back." Peter looked down at Max, who thumped his tail against the bed at the sound of his name. "Yeah," he said softly. "He's a good boy. The best boy." As Peter regained his strength, the hospital staff worked to connect him with resources that could help him get back on his feet. They reached out to local shelters and social workers, ensuring he wouldn't return to the streets once he was discharged. Laura was heavily involved, using her connections to find a shelter that allowed pets. She knew that wherever Peter went, Max had to go too. Separating them wasn't an option. One evening, as Laura was finalizing arrangements, she overheard two nurses talking about Peter and Max in the hallway. "It's amazing, isn't it?" one of them said. "That dog might have saved his life. And now they're inspiring everyone around here." The other nurse nodded. "I've seen patients light up just watching them. It's like they remind people that there's still goodness in the world." Laura smiled to herself, feeling a swell of pride. She had always believed in the power of human and animal connections, but seeing it unfold in real time was something else entirely. The day Peter was discharged was bittersweet. The hospital staff gathered to say goodbye, many of them stopping to pet Max and wish Peter well. Laura stood by, watching as Peter carefully climbed into the transport van that would take him to the shelter. Max hopped in after him, settling beside his owner with his usual calm demeanor. As the doors closed, Peter leaned out and looked at Laura. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, "for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't listened to Max that night." Laura waved, her smile bright, but her heart heavy. "You don't have to thank me. You two saved each other. Just take care of yourself." And Max, the van pulled away, and Laura stood in the parking lot, watching until it disappeared from view. She felt a mix of emotions: relief, hope, and a deep sense of connection to the man and his dog who had reminded her why she loved her job. In the weeks that followed, Peter and Max settled into their new lives. The shelter provided a warm bed, meals, and a sense of community that Peter hadn't experienced in years. Max became something of a mascot, his friendly demeanor and unwavering loyalty endearing him to everyone who met him. Peter began volunteering at the shelter, helping others who were in the same position he had once been in. He shared his story openly, not out of pity but to inspire. "If Max could find a way to save me," he often said, then maybe there's hope for all of us. News of their story spread, first through the local community and then beyond. A journalist who had heard about the dog that blocked an ambulance wrote an article, which quickly went viral. Donations poured in for the shelter, and people from all over sent letters and messages, moved by the tale of Peter and Max. One day, Laura visited the shelter, unable to resist checking in. She found Peter sitting on a bench outside, Max at his feet, as usual. Peter looked healthier than she'd ever seen him, his face fuller, his eyes brighter. Max, too, seemed to glow with happiness, his coat clean and his tail wagging constantly. "They're treating you well here," Laura said, sitting beside him. Peter nodded. "Better than I deserve, maybe, but Max seems to think otherwise." Laura laughed, reaching down to pet the dog. "Max knows best." As they sat there, watching the world go by, Peter turned to her. I used to think I was alone in this world, that I didn't matter to anyone. But Max never let me believe that. And now I think he was right. There's still good out there. People who care." Laura smiled. "You're proof of that." "And Max? He's a hero." Peter looked down at his dog, his expression soft. "Yeah, he is." In time, Peter and Max's story became a symbol of hope and resilience. The alley where Peter had been found was cleaned up and transformed into a small garden, with a plaque commemorating the dog who had saved a life. It read, "In honor of Max, the dog who never gave up," a reminder of love's unyielding strength. Peter and Max visited often, sitting on a bench beneath the plaque and greeting passersby who stopped to admire the space. For Peter, it was a reminder of how far they had come. For Max, it was just another place to be by his human side. And for everyone who heard their story, it was proof that love, loyalty, and a little bit of courage could change the world.